When the planes hit on 9/11, Roger Ferguson was serving as the vice chair of the Federal Reserve, and he was the only reserve governor on duty in Washington. So it fell to him to fashion an immediate response to something none of us had ever seen. We're delighted now to welcome Roger Ferguson back to Wall Street Week. Thanks for being with us, Roger. Take us back 20 years now. I know you've thought about it a fair amount. What did you face? What did you do?
Well, as you said, first, let me thank you for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure to be here. As you said, the context was confronting in real time a set of circumstances that none of us could ever have imagined. And so, the good news was, in some ways, my wife called me at about 9 o'clock or so to let me know that something was going on. I saw the second plane go into the second tower and knew immediately that there was going to be chaos in and around Wall Street. Obviously, I didn't foresee, the eventuality of the towers falling. But my first step, literally at about 9:10 or 9:15, was to call a woman named Louise Roseman, not a household name, but she was responsible for Reserve Bank operations and for payment systems. I worked with her, and immediately at 9:44, we put out a statement, the first of several statements that we made on that day, that indicated that something called FedWire was operating, and it would stay open as late as necessary for orderly transitions. Now, for the average person, that wouldn't mean very much. For individuals in the financial markets, it meant that the veins, the arteries, the plumbing of the financial payment system was still operating, which was critically important for moving payments around, which was the most important thing. So after that, the next step was to say, particularly once we saw the towers fall, what's the Fed's reaction going to be? And what we did was convene a discussion. I had a statement all prepared that was very brief. And that second statement said, and this was for the public, that the Federal Reserve was open and operating, sentence one, and sentence two, which was more for the technician, that the discount window would be available. So what does that mean in normal speak? Open and operating is pretty clear. What it meant in the second part was not only was the payment system, the veins and the arteries working, but that we, the Federal Reserve, were prepared to pump the lifeblood, the liquidity into that system to keep it functioning. And our entire goal for the next 3 days was to keep the financial system functioning, thereby keeping the entire economy going. And that was a single goal, that was a purpose. And fortunately, things worked out well for us.
How vulnerable were we as a country because of a particular location of the World Trade Center and the damage done down there? Because an awful lot of that plumbing, as you say, the physical plumbing, is right in that vicinity.
We were very vulnerable. We actually didn't know how vulnerable we were, frankly. But in that region, Lower Manhattan, major financial services firms, well understood. The New York Stock Exchange, everyone understands the value there. Importantly, one of the major banks that does the clearing between other institutions was headquartered there. So we knew all of that, as well as the New York Federal Reserve Bank, which is pivotal to the operations. What we didn't know was that there were a number of telephone connections within a few blocks of the World Trade Center. And so much of the financial infrastructure actually had what we call a single point of failure, those telephone connections. So we were actually surprisingly vulnerable to this kind of attack on that day. But fortunately, backup systems worked, and we actually got through with less damage than would have been possible had things not had the kind of backup that we ultimately found necessary.
Roger, you were a key leader in a key place at a time that, as I say, was unprecedented. Nobody could have anticipated. From that experience, what could you tell others who might be thrust into that kind of situation, not to that degree, but similar circumstances, a crisis that comes up you can't experience?
Well, there are a number of lessons that we learned that we could share with everyone at this around how to manage through a crisis. One I've already talked about, which is while the spotlight's often on the leader, it's actually the team that matters. And you have to really rely on the expertise, in the case of the Fed, of literally thousands of people to do their jobs. And so the team matters. Second point is very much around having clarity of goal, of intention, of principle. As I said, the Federal Reserve's main goal on that day was to use all of our resources to keep the financial system afloat in the United States and more, by definition, more globally. And so that's important. Be clear about what the guiding principles are. The third lesson on that day was communication, communication, communication. In the midst of a crisis, people are looking for clarity. Without facts and guiding principles from the top, people make things up. So communication is really important. And the fourth lesson there is actually the leader does, or the leadership team does play a role across all those things. You know, the leadership team has got to be clear about the guiding principles. The decisions that the leadership team has to make has to be driven by expertise. Two other things that are important around the leadership team. One is obviously fortitude. You know, you don't want to see the leaders quaking like a bowl of jelly when you get into a crisis. And then the fourth thing for the leadership team is a surprising one, which is empathy. When you're going through a crisis, it affects everybody differently. And an understanding of that is, I think, really important.
Roger, we can't anticipate the next thing that cannot be anticipated by definition, but let's talk about risks going forward. It's a different world today than it was 20 years ago. It's much more on the internet. It's much more in the cyber world rather than the physical world of traders at a trading floor down in southern Manhattan. What do we know? What do you think about the resilience we might have if we had a major failure of cyber?
Look, I think that's a major challenge for every financial services firm and for all of our institutions. Unfortunately, we've seen sort of elements of that when you have these so-called ransomware attacks or denial of service attacks at a small level. We haven't seen it systematically across an organization or across a financial system, but I would say that's one of the areas to really watch. And there have been hints of how dangerous that could be. And so that's one that I worry about, a great deal. I think all of us do. The good news is it is an area that is one of intense focus. The bad news is that the actors are not just state actors anymore, and they're not necessarily sort of large. They can be small individual actors that are hard to detect. And so I think right now we're in a sort of a bit of an equilibrium. I think the risk around cyber is much higher. I think our expectations and awareness are much higher, but we haven't really experienced the full magnitude yet. And it's an area that I think we should pay a great deal of attention to.
Roger, thank you so very much for being with us on Wall Street Week. That's Roger Ferguson. He's the former president and CEO of TIAA.